In just 10 months, Donald Trump has pulled off something no U.S. president has managed in half a century, and the country will be paying for it. He's added an astonishing $1.6 trillion to the national debt, setting a new record for the fastest debt buildup in modern history. In July alone, his administration overspent the budget by $291 billion. In less than a year, America's finances have been drained at a pace unmatched in the last 50 years. Trump has outspent every modern president, all while insisting he's saving the economy. In reality, this is reckless, runaway borrowing that will burden taxpayers, businesses, and families for decades. What makes it even harder to grasp is the contradiction between the message and the math. While he talks about making America great again, the figures point in the opposite direction, toward a nation going broke faster than anyone thought possible. And the deeper we dig into the numbers, the more troubling the picture becomes. So stay tuned, because this story only gets worse from here. Let's get into it. On July 28th, the U.S. Treasury quietly released figures that landed like a fiscal bombshell. Washington will need to borrow $1.6 trillion in new net marketable debt before the end of 2025. This isn't money to cover long-term investments or one-time emergencies. It's fresh debt stacked on top of a mountain the country is already struggling to carry. The reason is simple. The federal government is spending far more than it brings in. In the first 10 months of fiscal 2025 alone, the U.S. has already posted a $1.6 trillion deficit, $109 billion more than at the same point in 2024. At this pace, the shortfall could push past $3 trillion by year's end, smashing through modern records and dragging America into dangerous, uncharted financial territory. The borrowing schedule is already laid out. Between July and September, the Treasury will issue at least $1 trillion in new debt. From October through December, another $590 billion. And those figures only account for net new borrowing. They don't include the trillions that must be refinanced just to replace maturing debt. It's like paying off one maxed-out credit card with another, and then taking on a third just to keep the lights on. Part of this new borrowing will go into the government's main operating balance, known as the Treasury General Account, or TGA. By year's end, the TGA is projected to hold $850 billion, nearly twice its current level. But only $400 to $500 billion of the planned borrowing will actually reach that account. The remaining $1.2 trillion will simply disappear into day-to-day deficit spending. Money that leaves as fast as it arrives, because tax revenues can't keep pace with obligations. This is where the political talking points collide with reality. The White House has been quick to highlight higher customs duties, claiming they bring stability and strength to the budget. It's true that tariff revenue is up. July alone brought in a haul in the high 20 billions. Yet even with that boost, the monthly deficit still grew nearly 20% year over year, hitting about $291 billion. That gap exists because spending on Social Security, healthcare, and especially interest on existing debt is climbing much faster than tariff income can cover. And that interest bill is no longer a distant worry. America has already surged past $37 trillion in total debt, years ahead of the pre-pandemic projections, and is now approaching $38 trillion. Each new dollar borrowed locks in more interest that must be paid every year going forward. No tax policy tweak or short-term trade strategy can change the math. Servicing the debt will consume a growing share of the budget, leaving less for everything else, no matter who is president. Tariffs might deliver applause lines at rallies, but they don't close a gap of this size. The real danger is the speed of the borrowing itself. If the government is adding debt at this rate in relatively stable times, the question becomes, what happens when the next real crisis hits? That's when borrowing costs spike, revenues drop, and the fragile balance keeping the system afloat can tip in a matter of weeks. Month after month, Washington is outspending and outborrowing what it did in 2023 and 2024. The only exception was June. And that was no real slowdown, just a statistical blip before the climb resumed. We're now seeing levels of spending and borrowing not witnessed since the COVID stimulus surge of 2020 and 2021. The difference this time? There's no pandemic, no national disaster, and no extraordinary event to justify it. This is routine government operation, and it's burning through cash faster than ever. The numbers tell the story. In January 2024, the national debt stood at $34 trillion. By July, it reached $35 trillion. By December, $36 trillion. And by August 2025, $37 trillion. That's about $1 trillion added every 5 to 6 months, roughly twice the pace of the long-term average over the past quarter century. The debt curve isn't just climbing, it's steepening. And when that happens, the consequences cascade. Credit ratings decline, interest payments surge, and policymakers lose room to maneuver. Even in months when the Treasury collects more from tariffs or posts a rare, tiny surplus, the effect barely registers. Spending obligations and interest costs are rising together, erasing those small gains almost instantly. This isn't a still shot of America's finances. It's a time-lapse where the figures blur and the trajectory bends sharply upward. Left unchecked, that trajectory points toward a crash. The growing interest burden is one of the most alarming parts of the picture. By 2034, watchdog estimates suggest interest payments alone will absorb 29% of all federal revenue, over $2.2 trillion a year. That means nearly a third of every tax dollar will go to servicing old debt before funding schools, military readiness, infrastructure, or anything else. And the mechanism is unforgiving. Every dollar borrowed now locks in a stream of interest payments far into the future. This borrowing surge isn't just a current year problem. It's a commitment that will shape the next decade. Without serious changes, the Congressional Budget Office projects interest payments could hit the trillions annually in the coming years. A weight that would crowd out investment, slow growth, and leave the U.S. with fewer options when the next downturn comes. The question isn't whether this pace is sustainable. It's what happens when the inevitable pressure test arrives. If interest is already consuming a massive share of revenue in stable times, what will it look like when tax receipts fall during a crisis and borrowing costs spike at the same time? It's a fair question. Why can't Washington just stop borrowing, tighten spending, and balance the books? The answer is tied to the very structure of the U.S. economy. Every dollar in circulation represents someone's debt, and every debt carries interest. If the federal government suddenly stopped issuing new debt, the money supply would contract. And when dollars disappear from circulation, the economy doesn't slow down gently. It can fall into a full-blown deflationary spiral. Deflation might sound appealing, prices dropping, goods becoming cheaper. But in practice, it's economic poison. Lower prices slash business revenues, which forces companies to cut wages or lay off workers. Consumer spending drops further, profits vanish, and the downturn feeds on itself. That's what happened during the Great Depression, when falling prices, not just the stock market crash, turned a financial panic into a decade-long crisis. With less money in the system and debt still needing to be repaid, the economy begins to cannibalize itself. For decades, the U.S. has kept this cliff at bay by continually expanding the money supply through borrowing. It wasn't unique to one party. Both Republicans and Democrats relied on this approach. But today, that cycle has entered a far more dangerous phase. The debt isn't just rising. It's rising without a long-term plan, and the rest of the world is taking notice. In May 2025, Moody's, the last of the big three credit rating agencies to hold out, cut America's rating from the top-tier AAA to AA1. That downgrade is more than a number. It's a signal to global investors that U.S. debt now carries greater risk. Higher perceived risk means higher borrowing costs, and not just for the government. Businesses and households pay more too, from mortgages to business loans. History shows that once this kind of trust is broken, restoring it is slow, costly, and sometimes impossible. Meanwhile, the White House continues to promote higher tariff revenues as evidence of fiscal strength. But tariffs are a temporary cushion. Importers adjust, supply chains reroute, and trade partners look elsewhere. The windfall fades, yet the obligations remain. When a strong month for tariffs still leaves the country deeper in deficit, It's a preview of what happens in a weak month. When imports fall, revenue dips, and borrowing surges. That's when a deflationary spiral could accelerate from risk to reality, pulling jobs, businesses, and savings down with it. There's another side to this debt dynamic: wealth redistribution. Persistent borrowing and inflation shift value from savers to borrowers. Those who hold cash or low-yield investments lose purchasing power over time. Large borrowers, including major corporations and the government, benefit as inflation erodes the real cost of their debt. Over years, this imbalance transfers economic power away from wage earners and toward asset owners, deepening inequality and making the system more fragile. We often hear that America is the richest country in the world. But the part that rarely makes headlines is that the United States owes vast sums to foreign governments. And those governments earn billions from that debt every year. These aren't minor lenders. They are some of the world's biggest economic powers: China, Japan, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Together, they hold a substantial share of America's IOUs, giving them both steady profits and potential leverage over U.S. policy. Right now, Japan, China, and the UK are the top 3 foreign holders of U.S. Treasury securities, each with stakes worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Think of them as America's largest credit card companies, collecting interest payments while knowing there's little urgency for Washington to pay down the balance. The arrangement works in their favor. The more the U.S. borrows, the more interest flows to Tokyo, Beijing, and London. All in U.S. dollars, still the world's reserve currency. And when America's credit rating slips, as it did in May 2025, those interest rates edge higher. That means even larger transfers of wealth from the U.S. economy into foreign coffers. The deeper the fiscal hole, the more these countries stand to gain, without passing a single law, imposing a tariff, or mobilizing any military force. They're also far from passive investors. China has already shown it can wield its U.S. debt holdings as a bargaining chip. Simply hinting at slowing or halting Treasury purchases can rattle Wall Street and put pressure on Washington during trade disputes. Japan benefits from America's dependence as well. It helps support the yen and gives Tokyo additional weight in negotiations over trade and security. For all the patriotic speeches and flag-waving, America's economic engine is running on borrowed fuel, much of it supplied by nations with their own ambitions. Every new dollar of debt strengthens their grip, and every payment sent abroad is a reminder that influence can be bought not just with armies, but with credit. The more dependent the U.S. becomes on this flow of foreign capital, the narrower its room to maneuver when those lenders decide to cash in on the leverage they've built. The question is, when that day comes, will America still be free to choose its own course, or will it be negotiating its future at someone else's table? If you want to understand the forces shaping that future, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on, because the next chapter in this story is already being written.